we're going to talk about climate refugees. And how important do you think it is to connect, Shora? You've been digging deeply into this issue for a while now, to raise the level of awareness of people with the connection between climate refugees and climate issue.
I think it's very important because, as we are seeing now, a lot of people are fleeing, for example, from Syria.
So hang on a second. Is that working the mic? Just turn it up a bit.
Are you hearing me?
A little bit louder, I think.
Okay, so as we are seeing, for example, the conflict in Syria, one of its root causes is climate change. You cannot say it's the root cause, but it's one of them. And the thing is that we don't have a legal definition of climate refugees. So it is a bit difficult to talk about climate refugees in terms of legal issues, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist. If we don't have a legal definition, the people don't exist that are climate refugees. So they are there. There are already people moving around in the world because of climate change, and mostly they are in the global south. And we have to talk about them, because I don't think if we talk about them and give them a legal status, suddenly everything will be solved. But it's a first step to actually acknowledging people fleeing because of climate change, and how we can manage to either help them when they flee or actually do something so that people don't have to flee.
So how do you suggest we go about to getting a legal status for these people in terms of climate refugees?
Oh, that is something that politicians and policymakers have to do. But we as people, as activists, as people living privileged lives in the global north, we can actually talk about it, we can acknowledge them, and try to push our politicians to actually make some decisions to acknowledge them and to help them.
Mattias, you're a very influential person in Sweden in terms of sustainability and climate and top things. How do you suggest that we actually focus more on this connection?
Well, first of all, if I am very influential, let me use a little bit of that influence to really recommend Shora's book, because it's a great read. And it's one of the few reads that...
Hold it up a bit so we can see.
Yeah.
And the title is...
Can you please zoom?
It's written in Swedish, so it's called Ur askan, om människor på flykt i en varmare värld.
It's a great book, and it's one of the few reads in Swedish about climate change and what we call climate change and refugees. And in a few weeks, we're at Forest, the think tank that I'm heading. We're coming with what I believe is the first report in Swedish about the exact issue, about the legal definition on climate refugees and how many there are and where they're from and where they're going and where it's going in the future. So it's sort of a meta report of all the different scientific reports that's been out there. And I'd like to, much the same as you did, Shora, but the other way around, saying that we know that. And I was just now at Moderaternas stämma here in Malmö. And many people in Moderaterna and in other parties, and probably among you as well, think, well, climate change, that's important, but it's not urgent. There's other things that are more urgent, such as refugees. But when we say, hey, those two things are really linked, a lot of these refugees are already there because of climate change, then we realize the urgency of climate change as well. So it's really a two-way street where we see that we need to focus more on the refugees because of climate change, and we need to focus more on climate change because of the refugees. And I think I did everything but answer your question.
That's okay. That's okay.
But
it was an interesting reflection anyway, yes.
How we can focus more on this, I think it's very important that maybe we're going to discuss that more in the future, but the legal definition, so in the International Convention on Refugees, climate refugees are not there. That's basically because we did the convention in 1951. We didn't know so much about climate change then. But also, if we try and introduce it now, I'm very worried it will backfire, because we know that if we touch the convention, so many, and that's even before Trump is president in the US, so many people are going to say, well, we're going to have to take out stuff. So I think the answer to that is don't touch the convention, but individual regions like the EU and individual countries like Sweden and individual donors like the rest of us can say that we do acknowledge climate refugees, and we know that they need protection, somewhere to go, and somebody to help them find shelter.
What do you say, Shora? Should we rock the boat and look at the original convention, or should we stay like Mattias says?
No, I agree with Mattias. We shouldn't do anything about the Geneva Convention because it's already not used as it was supposed to be used. A lot of people that need protection, they don't get it because we don't apply the Geneva Convention in the right way. But there are a lot of activists in other countries and also researchers, because this is a field that has been researched in academia a long time. They're saying that we should have another convention, something close to Geneva, but for climate refugees. And I just want to read a small definition from two researchers, Frank Bierman and Ingrid Boas. They're researchers in the Netherlands. Frank Bierman is also a guest professor in Lund University. And they have a very good definition that I think we should try to use, even if we just want to acknowledge people here between us. Because according to Geneva Convention, a refugee is also a person who crosses a border. You have to cross a border to be a refugee. A majority of the times, climate refugee, they don't cross a border because people have to flee within their own region, within their own country. And that is also what all the refugee studies teach us, that people flee short when they flee. Because if you want to flee a long distance, you have to have a lot of resources. But also a lot of people, they want to go back to their region or to their home where they have their culture, where they have their languages and so on. So if you have a new definition, then you can also acknowledge people who have to flee. For example, when I was in Pakistan, 20 million people fled within Pakistan because of a lot of monsoon in 2010. So their definition is a climate refugees are people who have to leave their habitats immediately or in the near future because of sudden or gradual alternation in their natural environment related to at least one of three impacts of climate change: sea level rise, extreme weather events, and drought and water scarcity. And this is a very good definition because you can apply that on, I don't know, Swedes who have to flee from one city to another, or for example during Katrina where people fled within the US, or a person who comes from Syria to Europe.
You talked about sort of a meta research being presented soon. The digit I've heard is around 60 million people that are currently fleeing. How many percent do you think of those are actually related to climate?
Well, the 60 million figure is from the UNHCR, and the UNHCR says that in the future climate refugees is going to be the fastest growing, and in a while also the biggest group of refugees. And this tells us two things. First, it tells us about the urgency to fix climate. It means also the xenophobic who don't care about climate change, even they should get involved for other reasons. So we should all, no matter what we think, should get involved. Second, it tells that even though there's no definition, there is still some sort of a working definition, because UNHCR, which is part of the UN, they managed to know how many there are. So we roughly know whom they are, where they are, and we just got to also keep in mind that part of this is just bad governance. When I used to live in Kenya, people become climate refugees not only because of climate change, but also because the bad government made sure that there's no mangroves left that protect people from the storms and the rising sea levels. So I also think that we need to have factor in a component that we need better governance in those countries most vulnerable.
That's for sure.
Can I just say something
absolutely.
shortly to that? 2013, the Norwegian Refugee Council wrote a report on the people who fled during 2012. And keep in mind, this was before the big catastrophe, the refugee catastrophe from Syria, so this was before a lot of people left Syria. They said that during 2012, 32.8 million people fled. Out of those, 98% of them fled because of climate and weather-related causes. So it can also mean a tsunami, for example, that doesn't have anything with climate change to do, but it showed that before the big Syrian conflict, climate change is actually running forward in being the cause that people have to flee instead of war and conflict. Because like 20 years ago, a lot of people fled because of war and conflict, and now they're actually fleeing because of climate change. So
And climate change and lack of water can also create war.
Yeah, of
obviously.
course. Like you can see
And lack
in
of
Syria.
food, etc. In Syria, yes, yes, yes. Shora, you brought some pictures.
Yep.
Would you like to show them
Sure.
to us? We have a screen behind us. Well, they're up already. I'm going to change places with you so I can see.
So I went to 3 countries and interviewed people who had to flee. These are very short stories. This is in the Swat Valley of Pakistan. Can you see the picture? Oh, good. Okay, so what do you think of when I say Swat Valley? Have you heard about Malala? The girl or young woman who is fighting for girls' right for education because the Taliban are very strong in Swat Valley. So when I was in Swat Valley, that was almost half a year after the big floods in 2010, where 20 million Pakistanis had to flee within their own country. And when I asked them, have you been fleeing before? And they said yes, because there is a war between the Pakistani army and the Taliban. But we can always go back to our homes. But this time it was different. So this is where people had relocated from a village called Kawara. They started to build up their tents into homes. This is how it looks like. This is a small room and a kitchen. And you can see the toilet on your left. And this is Aisha. She was 30 years old, and she used to work as a seamstresser. She lived in a house with her brother and his family. Her parents passed away some years before the floods. And a lot of people didn't want to talk to me because they were scared what it would mean to talk to a journalist because of, the government and so on. But I asked Aisha to talk to me, and she lost everything. She lost their home. She lost everything she owned, so she couldn't sew anymore, unfortunately, and make a living. And her brother went... Oh, sorry. Sorry. Hello? Is this good? Okay, so her brother went from city to city to try to find a job and money from each day. And I asked her, if you can save up money, can you build out your house again? And she said, no, we couldn't. Even if we had to work 10 years and save the money, we cannot build up our house because the land our house was built on is gone. And I couldn't understand, what does it mean the land is gone? Can you imagine that the land is always there? So we went to her village where she showed me that where the trees were used to be the land that her house was on. So this is very close to the Swat River. So when a lot of rain came and a lot of masses of water came down, the Swat Valley was became much wider than it used to be. So actually the land that Aisha's house was built on is gone. So where should she go? She cannot ever come back to her home. So she and some other people fled up to another village and tried to make a living there. I was supposed to go to Syria after I was in Pakistan and Kenya, but because of the situation in Syria, I couldn't go. But I had heard about the big droughts there, how many people had to move, 1.5 million people had to move into the cities. So instead I went to Kenya because it was a big drought there as well. And there I met Fayo and her 2 kids, Rilwan and Abdel Fattah. At that point, Rilwan was 1.5 and Abdel Fattah 3. And she was a pastoralist. She and her husband had goats and cows, and that's how they made their living. But this big drought of 2012 made everything dry. So they didn't have anything left but 3 goats. And she saw the children in the school in her village in northeast of Kenya, that they were hungry, and she didn't want that for her children. So they decided to go into Nairobi, which is the Kenya's
Capital.
Capital, thank you, where they had to live in a slum area called Korogocho. So now her husband worked 16 hours per day to make a living, to try to pay rent for this small house that they had. And she really felt like a refugee. She was far away from her family. She was alone. And this is how she made food in a very simple way. But she was happy that her children could eat at least 3 times a day. And this is a very common way of being a climate refugee today in the world. You go from your village, where you had lived, from the land. Most of the people live from the land or from the sea or from the animals in these regions. And then you have to go into the cities because you lose everything, or because you don't have this buffer between you and how climate change is affecting the nature. So you have to go into the cities, and then there you have to start working instead and making money. Instead of working for yourself, you start to work for another person. Right now there is a big drought going on in India. It's been on record that it's 51 degrees Celsius warm in some places, and thousands of farmers are moving from their land into the cities. So they're actually, right as we speak now, becoming climate refugees because they cannot go back to the land, because when a land is dried up, you need a lot of water to make it live again. So they have to go into the slums and they work for someone else, and then their standard of living comes down, of course, and so on. So you get an idea of these people.
Thank you very much, Shora. Please take a seat again. Mattias, you worked in and lived in Nairobi, and you actually mentioned to me, it just whispered in my ear, that you actually worked in the same slum area that you Shora showed us pictures from. In your view, how can the powers, the sort of the activism in terms of human rights and volunteers in the third world, developing world, together with the climate movement, go hand in hand and push this issue even better?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for us to realize, and I think these stories do help, that climate change is not gradual. It's stepwise. When we work with the Maasai farmers in Kenya, all the farmers, they would plant their maize or corn in mid-April because they knew that early May they would get the rains. Now they still try and plant in mid-April, and sometimes the rain come early and then it just washes everything away. Sometimes it comes too late, and then everything's dried out. So that means that was just a few years ago was a sustainable way of living is now impossible. And that very rapid change is something that we just got to realize. It's not that it's okay at 1.5 degrees, then almost at 1.6, and then no, you get a step, and then it's just not possible to live there any longer. Then you move to Karagocho or other waste sites, or at the end of the day, we find that we get huge number of refugees from what looks like a very small change on the thermometer. And I think what part of your answer is that perhaps even more important than the climate agreement in Paris that we discussed earlier today, and that you can see at Naturskyddsföreningens video when you get home. Perhaps even more important is that we got the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 målen as we call them in Swedish, where we say that we all need to fix this. It's not for the developed world to help the developing, it's for everyone to help everyone. And all these 17 areas go together, and my favorite goal there is number 17, which says that all different actors of society have to come together. But I speak to a lot of the development agencies. I was speaking to Rädda Barnen and Save the Children just this morning, saying that we need you to work on climate change. And they're like, we're not about climate change. And I'm like, yes, you are. So there's so many different institutions out there that still don't realize how central climate change is to the work they're doing, and how central their work is to help reduce the effects of climate change.
So we'll just have to send Shora's book to a lot of NGOs, right?
Yes, I did already, but if I can get hold of a few copies, I believe it's almost sold out. If I can get hold of a few more copies, I'll do that again.
Great. I'd like to do a little bit of a poll in the audience here. Hands up if you think we should try to work for climate issues to be grounds of international law for refugees. Who thinks we should change the law so international law will be taking into account that climate change is an issue? Hands up. All right. Reflections from the sofa?
I think in principle, those who raised your hand, you're right. In reality, I think it's going to require a lot of attention that we need to to use elsewhere, because the international community can only deal with so much, and our beloved government can also only deal with so much. And when we really want to work with this, it's not the convention that's important, it's the work on the ground. And then we need all humanitarian organizations to have a strong climate change component, and also all the environmental organizations to realize the refugee has to be part of their work. And we also need a two-pronged approach from the Swedish government, where we need to focus on mitigation, reducing the emissions, but not be ashamed to also work, and we've been ashamed, to also work with adaptation much more strongly, adapt to the changing climate that's already there.
What do you say, Shora?
No, I totally agree, because we already have a warming and people are already fleeing, but we can actually stop this. We can actually make the climate stable so that more people don't have to flee. And that means that we need to engage much more in stuff that we can do here. And last week I was in Germany at Ende Gelände, where a lot of activists actually stopped Vattenfall's production of electricity for one whole day, because they occupied from 5 different ways. And this is brown coal, lignite, and it's very dirty. It's the dirtiest of all fossil fuels. And what we can do here is also stuff like this, to actually make people be able to stay in their home. We can actually let fossil fuel stay in the ground. So what people in Ende Gelände did are actually also helping the climate refugee issue as much as actually giving them a legal status, if you understand what I mean.
This year we had Musikhjälpen. The theme for Musikhjälpen was that nobody should have to run away from an escalating climate situation. So do you think the knowledge in Sweden, the Swedish population is strong enough, high enough about this connection between climate and refugee situation?
I think the knowledge is, or the framing is done in a stupid way. When you frame climate refugees, it's about those small islands that are sinking. Or the iceberg, there's a polar bear on the iceberg, and the iceberg is melting and the polar bear doesn't have anywhere to swim. Or it's Tuvalu or Vanuatu, of one of those small islands where we've never been, and the only thing we know about them is that there's very few people there. So I think the framing needs to be different, because you're gonna be right. It's gonna be in our part of the world as well, and where it's already now is also in very highly densely populated areas. So it's already millions of people. It's not for the future. It's not just small islands. It's right out there. But I think in general we realize that climate change is there. But what we don't realize is the connect between climate and many of the large refugee crises that we have now. When we're closing the bridge, and I'm so ashamed of 6 out of 8 Swedish political parties that closed the bridge and said not welcome to our brothers and sisters who are fleeing for their lives. When we did that, we didn't realize that many of them were fleeing because of a situation that we created.
That's a very brutal, but is very true connection that some parties definitely do not make. That's for sure. So, Shora, how do you think we could raise the awareness even more? I mean, you're doing a great job with your book. Are you out lecturing too?
Yeah, I do.
I figured you were.
But I think we should talk about it. And I also think that we should remember why the rich countries won't acknowledge climate refugees within their legal status. Because in Paris, during the COP meeting, it was a lot of talk about climate refugees. It was welcomed because before the Cancun meeting in 2010, I think, they didn't talk about climate refugees at all. It was like, no, we don't want to deal with this issue. But now they are actually talking about it, and there are different initiatives to try to raise this. But the problem is that their solutions, these big UNHCR or EOM and so on, their solutions are regional. Actually, one of the spokespersons from UNHCR told me, when it comes to refugees, we are a top-down approach. When it comes to climate refugees, it's bottom-up approach. I don't get that. What is that bottom-up? It means, what they mean is that, okay, so Kenya should take care of it, or Iran should take care of it, or Lebanon should take care of it. All the where actually the big amount of refugees in the world already are. So we need to actually understand that why they are not acknowledging climate refugees is because they don't want to acknowledge their that they are the rich countries, that they are the root cause of climate change. So when they do, if they do, that's also when we can open our borders and give people the safety that they need. But once again, bear in mind, most of the people that flee, they don't flee far. They want to flee within their region where they can speak the language, where they have the culture, where they can actually try to go back to their networks and to their homes. So this big thing that we're doing, oh no, we have to close Europe's borders because so many people are fleeing, they are not even 10% of all people, of all the refugees in the world are not even in the rich countries today.
They're sort of internal refugees. And we might...
Internal or within the region.
The region, yes. So how far do you think it's going to take us time before we actually have to flee from different regions in Sweden? I'm looking at, for instance, Falsterbo, which might be immersed in water if they don't build the walls high and fast enough. And Kristianstad, which is the city in Sweden that's the place in the lowest level, below actually the sea level. So if you look in time and perspective, could that studies and talks about this happening actually help the politicians to look on a more global perspective?
Well, it does help that we realize that, for instance, Kristianstad is up to 4 meters below sea level. So they need to prepare themselves, and they've been doing that for centuries.
Yeah, they're doing quite
but
well,
I don't
actually,
think many people are going to flee in Sweden, even though we had people in Malmö, and you've seen the pictures, people fled from a bus in Malmö. They had to be evacuated because the tunnel was flooded. But in general, if you're rich enough, you can pay enough so you don't have to flee. You can build walls. But I'm so disappointed that when we do most of our adaptation, when we raise the walls to adapt to climate change, like for instance in Slussen, that's in Stockholm, which I pass every day, we use that by using more cement. What does cement do? Well, it increases emissions. So when we adapt to climate change, we create more climate change. Kristianstad is one of the few examples that when they do adapt to climate change, they create less climate change because they plant trees that can take care of the flooding. They make wetlands, they make raised through earth, they raise earth, and then they have bikeways, so it's easier to bike. So they make sure that the adaptation reduces the climate change, but almost everyone else adapts through more cement, and then we get more climate change, and then those that can't pay their way out are just going to suffer more.
I don't know about Sweden because I didn't study Sweden, but it's also interesting to compare, for example, Egypt, that is where the sea level is rising a lot and the delta is sinking. People are already fleeing with boats to Italy, for example. And you can see the same situation in Netherlands, where they actually have resources and a good plan to protect their people. During the 30 years of the dictator Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, they didn't do stuff like this to protect their own people. So all this have to do resources. And that's also why it's important that we mitigate, of course, but also that the rich countries actually can pay these not so rich countries to try to adapt, as Mattias is saying. The green fund is still like very low.
I'd like to raise a short issue there, and there's the Green Climate Fund.
We talked a little bit about this earlier today.
We did earlier, so you can watch a video, but another thing is that the Green Climate Fund has maybe not gotten enough money, but it's got a lot of money. And we don't know if they're doing anything, we just know that they had the world's most expensive office in South Korea, whereas the Adaptation Fund, it's already there, and it's focusing exclusively on climate adaptation. That fund is empty.
That's a bit odd, really. Bringing it back to Sweden again, 2 years ago we had a massive flood in Malmö, with the bus you just mentioned, among other areas. I mean, most of Malmö was flooded. And the insurance companies are starting to sort of evaluate that we might not be able to insure homes for flooding. What do you think that could mean to the public in terms of raising the awareness and the knowledge, and also sort of put some power, push some power on the political system? Because this will actually be costing private homeowners quite a lot of money when the next rain comes, because it will be coming quite soon.
It's going to change what we perceive as an attractive housing and not so attractive. Basically, the World Insurance Federation in Paris said a world beyond 2 degrees of climate warming is uninsurable. We can't insure it because it's not the warming in itself, of course. It's the rising sea levels, but it's also the tougher rains, the storms. All of these things make it much. It's going to be much more expensive in the short term, and in the longer term, many things are not even going to be possible to insure yourself against. And what you see in the ads that today says sjönära, you're going to be living close to the sea, and tomorrow you're going to think, hey, that's going to mean I'm going to be underwater fairly soon. So a lot of people are probably going to think twice before they want to move into that kind of areas. And that's going to change what's attractive and what's not. So the pricing mechanism is super important. And I think we as consumers or as humans, we react strongly to price mechanisms. So hopefully that's going to be a driver to reduce climate emissions.
And even in people buying real estate in the Mediterranean, sometimes I speak with people that are looking into buying a flat or something in Spain. I said, well, consider the heat factor. Very soon we will have probably climate refugees from the Mediterranean area knocking on our doors, wanting to vacate and have vacations in Malmö, which could be good for Malmö in a way, but troublesome in other ways. Yes. Let's take a little question to the audience here. I think this is an easy one, but we'll just have lots of hands up. It's lovely. Should the climate issue be more linked in the public eye and in media, etc., with the climate refugee situation? Should we link it more closely? Yay. Yay. That's a dead giveaway. Great. So in terms of pushing the buttons on the politicians, what needs to be done, Shora?
That's a good question. From where I come from, politicians, they don't just do stuff. They need some pressure on them. And the only pressure they can get is from us sitting here all together. And that's why I always try to make people to actually engage in climate change stuff, because that is actually that's what is needed for all other stuff that you are fighting for. If you want to fight for good housing, or if you want to fight for open borders, when it comes to it, it's climate change that is
It's the foundation.
The foundation, yeah. Because if we don't have a planet, or if we don't have a stable climate, then everything that we are fighting for is for nothing. And I don't mean to say that don't fight for the housing or whatever, but this is something that all the organizations or all the individuals should keep in mind. For example, right now, I cannot understand how Miljöpartiet, the Greens in Sweden, are thinking about Vattenfall. I was writing an article on Ende Gelände, and I just Googled how kolkraftverk, coal power plant looked like. So I Googled, and suddenly I came into Isabella Lövin's blog from 2 years ago. That's one of the new speakers of the Green Party. And she said, låt kolet ligga, let the coal be in the ground. And it was a power plant picture with a red cross on next to a windblower. And I was stunned. 2 years ago, they actually promised that they would let Vattenfall's coal be in the ground, and now they're not doing enough about it. So I think we just need to push them more, because if we don't, then they won't do it.
On the seminar just before this one, we spoke about emailing your politician. Actually, specifically, best would be on Monday afternoons, because they do have group meetings on Tuesday mornings. So that's top of mind. So maybe we should start emailing our politicians more. Make this connection, huh? And Jens Holm from Vänsterpartiet, who was just here before, I don't know if you attended, but he said, make sure when you write, to write hey and the name of the politician, and always sort of, finish off with your contact information and a question, because then they have to answer.
But then the good example, for example, is in Malmö. The news some days ago was that Malmö will divest from fossil fuels, within 2-3 years. And that is because people have been pushing the city of Malmö to do that, not because the politicians are so good in Malmö city. So keep doing that.
Mattias?
I really don't think that's the reason, because when Malmö and others are divesting, you know, I was elected, so most influential sustainability issues, and the one who was elected last year was the one who was pushing for divesting. So last year that meant if you managed to do that, you were influential. This year it's happening all by itself, because if you had money in oil a year ago, that oil was worth $140 a barrel. It's now down to 40 barrels, and the poor idiots who didn't divest at 140 are stuck with something that's only worth 40 and going downwards. So you're an idiot if you stick to fossil, and that's what everybody's realizing now, and that's the main driver. The economy is always going to be the main driver, and it's working for us now. Renewable is cheap, which is good, we can invest in it, and fossil is cheap, it's good, we want to get the hell out of it because before we lose even more money. So that's driver number one. Driver number two, I totally concur with Shora, it's the push in the political factor. And we see that basically the two big parties in Sweden are the problem. None of them want to be leaders in fighting climate change. Most of the other small to medium-sized parties are actually scrabbling to do something. But the Social Democrats and the Conservatives, I was just here in Malmö with the Conservatives, and they are lukewarm at best. They see global warming, but they're not focusing on it. So that's where we need to push more. We can't, and there's a very sad logic to it, because the Social Democrats think we shouldn't do too much because the Greens are going to push us to do it, and then we shouldn't allow them to get too much. And the Conservatives, the Moderaterna, think the same about Centerpartiet. That's for them to push on and for us to try and block. So there's a logic that we need to get out of, because it's urgent now. We said at Paris, we said 1.5 degrees, hopefully, and at least well below 2 degrees. Well, it looks like we're already at 1.4 degrees, so there's not much room for maneuver left.
For sure not. Let's open up for some questions. Hands up if you want a microphone. Birk from Natuurfondsvereniging is ready. There's one over here. Please state your name and if you're from an organization or anything else you want to tell us.
Hi, my name is Erica. I'm studying to become a kindergarten teacher. And I've been to a lot of the lectures today, very interesting. And my question is that, do you have any hope for the future? Because I have a lot of climate anxiety and I just feel like, how are you going to keep the hope after all these facts that you're hearing? It's so horrible.
It's a very valid question. How do you get up in the morning, Mattias?
You know, I think on average I spend 2 or 3 nights on night trains, or I get up, you know, the last thing I read is another damn climate report, and I get up at 6 to, you know, so the question is very valid. And sometimes even I sometimes think, damn, it's not going to work. But then I think, first of all, you know, the first thing you see when you wake up is your cell phone, your mobile phone. And then you start looking at it, and you realize that in this phone, it replaces so much stuff we used to have. Do you remember we used to have faxes and CD players and separate GPS and radios, and I still have a watch, but most people don't. So this alone represents the 80% CO2 reduction that we need to do. And then I meet with young people like, no, I'm never going to own a car. Why would I do something stupid like that? So I see that this huge CO2 reduction that we need to do, and many of my friends in the environmental movement says, you got to change your lifestyle. And I'm saying that lifestyle change is happening, and it's not happening because of climate change, it's happening because we want to. But we get the same CO2 reduction, and we get it because it's cooler to reduce your emissions, or to do stuff that does reduce the emissions. So that's my hope right there, that I think very few people in the future are going to think those things are cool that cause all these emissions.
That's very hopeful. Sure, how do you get up in the morning?
Yes, no, it is difficult actually, just to say yes. And since I got a kid, I really feel that it's so difficult to keep the hope up, because what is the future that she will live in? But just as I was very depressed, I went to Ende Gelände.
Hey.
And I actually saw what we can do together, what people can come together and do. And one of the activists that I talked to said this very, very important thing. He said that, yes, the politicians in the world, they even signed an agreement saying that we should keep it below 1.5 degrees. But nobody is actually doing anything about it. And within that small frame, we can do something. We get this legitimacy to actually act on it. And in Germany, neither the police, neither people from Vattenfall were aggressive towards the activists. that they used to be, because I've been to other protests, because the activists this time actually have a legitimacy to act on what they are doing. And that gave me a lot of hope, that we actually have this power and also the time to do something, and they cannot stop us, because we are saying, we are doing what the politicians say that they want to do. So that gave me a lot of hope to actually see that we can do something.
Thank you. Good question. I'm going to answer that question too, actually, because I get it too when I lecture. And it's, I said the only way to keep it at bay, that climate anxiety, is to actually act, to live, to lead by example. We talked about that before. To always try to walk the talk yourself, to inspire, and also just to be active. And I have 3 daughters, and for me it's very important to actually really do as much as I can, because in that I give them less anxiety. And I think that's, if you're going to work with children, if you sort of lead by example, that's going to lessen the anxiety for the younger generation. If we as middle-aged people sit and do nothing, and talking about myself, that just creates so much more anxiety in other generations. So it's really important.
And also one more thing, we shouldn't have anxiety, we should have anger.
Yeah.
Anger for this situation that is
Be more pissed off.
making, be pissed off. Don't feel depressed. Just be so angry, because when we see, for example, a war, when we see children killed, or when we see ISIS in the Middle East, we get angry with these. But when it comes to climate, suddenly we are not angry. We get depressed. So just be angry instead.
Channel the anxiety into fury and action. Good point. Let's take one more question. Up front here, please. Birk?
Yeah, I just wonder what's the difference between a poverty refugee and a climate refugee. Because like you said before, like the rich countries, they have the ability to adapt to the climate change. And at the moment, no rich countries, so to say, accept poverty refugees. Do you get my question?
How do you distinguish poverty from climate-related refugee situation?
Yeah.
Good question, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's probably not fruitful to try and go for legal binding definition of climate refugee, because it might be the climate that causes the maize to not grow, and then you're a refugee from starvation or from poverty, even though it's climate induced. Or it might be not the climate, but the flooding, and then, or it might be an environmental disaster that causes floodings, or they might be interlinked. It's very seldom only one factor. So I think maybe it's not so important to distinguish. If we do think it's important, we're going to find it very hard. And if we don't think it's important, we're going to find it very much easier. We're going to say, well, the important thing is that you need help, and we have the ability to help.
I think, though, it's important to have the definition. And for me, it was when I started to read about vulnerability that I understood what it was. Because if you think of a nutcracker, you have 2 handles and you have the nut inside. That's how I usually think of climate refugees. If you are poor, for example, Aisha that you saw, how come that they didn't flee before? Because just being poor, or to have not a good economic standard of living, that is one factor. But when you are a climate refugee, it's the other handle, and that the other handle is the new shocks that you get from the climate and the weather, and they are coming more and more often and more intense. So the nuts inside cannot be cracked with only one handle, not because you just are poor. You also have to have another push, or I mean, the nut is a person in here. And when it cracks, that means that it gets refugees. So that is the picture I use when I talk about climate refugees. But then I also agree, of course, like a lot of people are in need of help, and we should help them because we are sitting on the resources and we created this problem.
Important to remember that always. We created the problem. Huh? Before we finish off here, I'd like to ask you, Shora, where can we find your book?
Ad libris, I
Ad
suppose.
Okay.
Or
you don't sell it outside here.
No, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll give you another book, actually, and lots of stuff to read always as a thank you gift. And it's a book about the next subject that's coming up. It's on ecofeminism, and it's also a little goodie bag here from Green, one of our sponsors. in the book. I'll just hold it up so everybody can see. It's Climate Feminism, not Ecofeminism, sorry. Climate Feminism by Linnea Engström. So this is for you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Give them a warm hand. And what I didn't say in the beginning was that you probably missed Svante Axelsson. He was supposed to have been here in the sofa too, but his family is stricken by an evil stomach virus. So he stayed at home, supporting them and waiting his doom day, I think, too. So see you back in 15 minutes. Well, there'll be a speech from Lotta Hedström on ecofeminism. Thank you.